bringing you views and ideas on critical issues facing Sri Lanka today. The Interview.
Good evening. We are speaking with Asanga Welikala, Senior Researcher at the Center for Policy Alternatives based in Colombo. Asanga, welcome to the program. You recently released a book on states of emergency, particularly looking at the state of play in emergency rule in Sri Lanka. You make the point that Sri Lanka has been under emergency rule for as long as a particular generation. As long as they have been citizens of Sri Lanka, they have labored under emergency rule. Could you expand on that? What does that really mean?
Yeah, what has happened, frankly, is this, and it is what I call in the book the phenomenon of the normalization of the exception. The point that we must remember is that if we believe in fundamental rights and in the rule of law, but also that we recognize the fact that the executive, the government, needs to be at times given extraordinary powers to deal with particular types of crises. What we must remember, therefore, is what is the difference that we are making. That is the different distinction that we are making between what is a state of exception, a grave crisis that faces a society and a government that must be empowered to deal with that type of crisis, particularly violent armed threats to the established constitutional order of the state. But given the fact that we recognize that those states of exceptions must be provided for within the four corners of the rule of law, nonetheless, is also the assumption that we must return to what is normal within a reasonable period of time. What has happened in Sri Lanka, however, is that notwithstanding, I mean, there are obviously other reasons, constitutionally unresolved political problems that faces the Sri Lankan constitutional order, which has ensured protracted conflict over a period of time. But notwithstanding that, however, the perspective that I'm dealing with here is quite different, and that is, as you rightly said, where for about 30 years, apart from a few years in which, for various other reasons, that the emergency rule has lapsed, what we have nonetheless seen is a situation in which what has clearly been the exception, or what must be the exception, has become absolutely normal.
But I will come, perhaps the most difficult question here is, if that is the case, and in your book, as the foreword by Dr. Sarvanuthu also notes, and you have acknowledged in the text itself, if it is the case, then for nearly 3 decades you have had this exception as the norm, and if what you are trying to suggest is that we need to return to constitutional order and democratic governance, how then do you communicate that to a citizenry arguably incapable of imagining?
Very much so, and this is a classic problem that happens elsewhere as well in other countries, particularly in Latin and South America,
which have also undergone similar protracted
conflicts for long periods of time. What has happened is this: necessarily, what is, in other words, emergency powers given to a government to deal with serious crisis is also the expansion of the executive, and something must give. What gives are fundamental rights, and certain types of checks and balances then one must contemplate either are suspended or restricted. Now, when we have a situation like in Sri Lanka, as with the experience of other countries, what happens is the ratchet effect, where people get just used to the fact that this extraordinary types of power that government
this is the problem. This is the problem.
How do we get out of that? Big question, obviously, and certainly in conflicts like ours, it is not enough to just to say that insisting on basic principles of good governance is the answer. Clearly, because why has conflict been going on for 30-odd years, probably even more? So some would argue even probably more. Maybe perhaps our entire sort of post-independence experience has been one of ethno-political conflict and so on. So yes, the broader, substantive, more deeper answer to your question is that we must get back to a situation in which we resolve those anomalies that generate conflict, certainly.
But actually my question was in acknowledging what you actually said and all that you say in the text, but one of a particular problem, which is that for the enlightened thinkers in Sri Lankan society, there is that problem of communicating that which you hold and believe to be true, and that which some of us would agree and also acknowledge is true, to a wider citizenry, which would alienate you for the precise reason that you're articulating those ideas. In this case, what you say is an anomaly, and the exception is to them the norm, and it is one of conviction.
That's right.
Right? And how do you then communicate to them? And if I might put it bluntly, live to tell the story.
Yes, would be quite difficult.
Yeah.
I imagine. And,
what would the anchors be? I mean, is it through through a larger social constitutional debate?
Yes, I think so. Yeah. This book certainly is not in that sense a sort of advocacy document.
Sure.
It is not a basis for a widespread political social transformation that must happen, where people start saying that it is enough now. That governments have for too long experienced this sort of wonderful leeway in which they can do as they please. Frankly, to directly answer your question is impossible for me at the moment, I think, because what I believe is that there are few still people who would cherish their democratic freedoms, liberal values, all of these things that are so. But to answer your question in terms of how to communicate that, how to build a social movement which checks government, checks the state in doing this, that unfortunately is...
I'm going to put agent provocateur on that particular note, and then tell you that perhaps the exception and the protracted nature of the exception to the norm, to the rule, has been because of a non-state actor, which is the LTTE. And as long as the LTTE exists in the nature and manner that it does, then emergency rule is inevitable. And certainly this is one argument that is repeatedly told to us to be true.
Indeed.
And
of course.
What would your response be?
Well, the situation is this. The situation is that if we, my argument is that I don't want to, in any sense, absolve the LTTE for the very, very serious human rights violations, etc., that it has conducted. I mean, we have seen that it has consistently been intolerant of dissent within the Tamil polity and politics in particular. They have killed, maimed, and committed human rights violations as egregious as any that the state has done. We can't absolve that. But the argument that I would make, nonetheless, however, is this, and that is that the state is a political association, a form of political association that is very different from non-state actors. So while, of course, basic standards of human rights apply to everyone, state and non-state actors alike, how we treat the state must be very different, because we must hold them to a higher standard of...
I'm smiling because I felt the need to interject to say that in theory, because in practice, the state today is a very different beast, isn't it? And that's part of the problem that you're dealing with in this book, that you have technically the safeguards on paper, weak as they may be. But you have an executive in its enlarged capacity that is overriding many of those safeguards. And then, that's a different problem.
That's right. There are two things there. One is, of course, this, and that is that my perspective on this is that the state, even in a battle for its own survival, is not entitled to ride the horse and crutches over our rights. And that sphere of liberal autonomy that some of us believe is fundamental to the democratic way of life. That's the first thing. Secondly, of course, is this, and that is that if we start going down the path of saying, look, we are dealing with a very serious terrorist organization here, and therefore we must contemplate certain types of extra-legal powers that the state must have in order to deal with this much more serious crisis. So in order, therefore, also, they would argue that democratic freedoms, in fact, must be, and the democratic order, the constitutional order must be preserved. I don't believe that. I don't think you can pursue a counter-insurgency campaign, regardless of human rights standards, regardless of liberal values, regardless of any sort of respect for the democratic way of life, and yet win that battle in such a way that you will, at the end of it, regardless of whichever actor is left standing on the battlefield at the end of it, that we are going to ensure democracy and a just peace in this country.
Asanga, you're a very, very lone voice in this regard. Certainly the case that has been made by, say, the ambassador to the UN in Geneva, Dayan Jayatilaka, is that he agrees that there might be missteps the government has and will certainly make. But there is no return to the old order, and certainly no return to the current order once the war is won.
Right.
But to win the war, to win it, it is a total war in the Churchillian sense. Everybody needs to be part and parcel of it. And this, the question I want to attach to this is that you repeatedly mention national security as an overarching argument, an excuse for egregious violations of the Constitution. Now, as long as the war is on and victory is imminent, this will continue.
Yeah, I think Ambassador Jayatilaka's perspective is a matter of opinion. It is an opinion that I don't deal with in this book because, as I very clearly point out, the analysis in the book is relating to a certain area, which is beyond the scope of the book, which is the unresolved, the broader